Chapter 1. The gathering at the well. The air in Little Derby hung heavy and still, stifling heat that pressed down on the village like a thick quilt. Dogs sprawled flat on the cobbled streets, and farmers paused their work to mop sweat from their brows. The sky, tinged a sleepy yellow, seemed to hold its breath, not a leaf stirring in the hedges. It was the kind of afternoon when nothing was meant to happen, and yet something did. A scream, high and piercing, shattered the oppressive quiet, sending a shiver through the village. It came from the outskirts, near the old well, just beyond the last row of cottages. Long past its days as a lifeline, the well was now little more than a relic, visited only when pumps failed. Mrs. Wilkins, stout woman whose apron always bore traces of flour, was the first to arrive. She thrived on the village's small, drama's lost chickens. Missing spectacles, whispers of illicit romances, but nothing could have prepared her for this. Her scream, sharp enough to scatter birds from the hedges, followed her first horrified glance. There, dangling from the low, broad branch of the ancient oak overshadowing the well, were two figures, two young black girls. Their bodies swayed faintly in the barest breeze, limbs limp, heads tilted at unnatural angles, dark hair falling across still, unseeing faces. Mrs. Wilkins froze, her breath caught, her hand clutching her chest. Then, with a stumble, she turned and ran back toward the village, her cries trailing behind her. Within minutes, the narrow dirt path to the well was thronged with villagers. They arrived in clusters, some whispering, some gasping, others standing in stunned silence. Those who pushed forward for a closer look recoiled almost instantly, the weight of the sight settling over them like a suffocating shroud. A crime in Little Derby was unthinkable. Someone had already darted off to fetch Sergeant Fletcher, the local constable. He arrived, puffing from the effort, his broad shoulders and thick mustache marking him as a man better suited to wrangling stray livestock than unraveling mysteries. Still, he took charge. She tried to his voice, booming over the crowd. "Back, all of you," he barked, his authority straining against the horror before him. He barked, waving his arms in an authoritative manner. "None the crowd now," but the villagers did not move. It was then that Inspector Caldwell arrived, tall, gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. Caldwell carried himself with the air of a man who had seen too much and cared too little. Hasted onto the scene with a bored expression, his gaze sweeping over the gathered villagers, then to the bodies. Haberly paused before pulling out a small notebook. "Suicide, I imagine," he said briskly. A murmur of discomfort swept through the crowd. Sergeant Fletcher Ho had been frowning at the bodies with a rare display of thoughtfulness. "Hesitated, sir," he ventured, rubbing a hand over his mustache. "I'd say this looks a bit peculiar." "Nothing peculiar about a tragedy," Caldwell remarked, scribbling something onto the page with a flick of his wrist. A few villagers exchanged uncertain glances. Two girls, both so young, found hanging from a tree near a forgotten well. It did not sit right. It was at that moment that Miss Jane Marple arrived. She had not meant to come. She had, in fact, been settled comfortably in her niece's cottage, enjoying the relative peace that came with a hot cup of tea and an afternoon spent knitting. She had been working on a particularly delicate pattern, roses with just the right amount of detail to be interesting, but not so much as to be frustrating. But then she had heard that commotion outside. Miss Marple had learned over the years to trust the instinct that told her when something was amiss, and so, setting aside her knitting with a practiced emotion, she had gathered her shawl, slipped into her sturdy walking shoes, and followed the sounds of hurried footsteps, now standing at the edge, oft gathered villages. She took in the scene with a quiet, intense interest. Marple had always known that people tended to see what they were expected to see. Two girls hanged in a quiet village, terrible accident, a moment of despair, a simple tragedy she had known. Doubt that was what Inspector Caldwell saw, but Miss Marple saw something else entirely. She saw the way the rope had been tied, the way the bodies had been positioned, the odd disturbance in the dry, cracked dirt beneath the tree. She noted the distance of the well from the hanging branch, and the way the air seemed thick with more than just grief. It carried unease, an unspoken dread, the kind that came when something had gone very, very wrong. Inspector Caldwell had already begun to turn away, snapping his notebook shut with a decisive click. Nothing more to be done here, he said. Miss Marple's gentle blue eyes remained fixed on the bodies. There was something very, very wrong, and she intended to find out exactly what it was. Chapter 2. The Curious Marks. Process of lowering the bodies was a slow and careful one, made all the more awkward by the unnatural stillness of the victim's sergeant. Fletcher, red-faced with exertion, directed the constables as they worked the knots, their gloved hands trembling slightly as they loosened the noose. The old oak's gnarled branches groaned under the shifting weight, and at last the two lifeless forms were gently placed onto the ground. The crowd pressed forward, murmurs of grief and disbelief rippling through them, but a sharp bark from Inspector Caldwell sent them retreating a step. Give them space, cast his usual indifference, giving way to irritation. He took a peremptory glance at the bodies, a mere flick of his gaze, and turned to face the onlookers. Anyone know them? For a long moment there was silence, broken only by the rustling of wind through the grass and the muffled sob of someone in the crowd. Then a voice, low, thick with grief, cut through the quiet. They are my daughters. The crowd parted instinctively as a man and woman stepped forward. William and Lelanina, Grace Cynthia, were well known in the village, quiet, hard-working, and never once to involve themselves in unnecessary disputes. They lived in a small cottage at the edge of Little Darb, near the fields where William worked as a farmer. Their daughters, Isabella and Ruth, were often seen helping their mother with the washing or walking into town for supplies. Now their young faces were frozen in something terrible. Not quit fear, not quit peace. Elenina gripped her husband's arm tightly, her entire body trembling as she stared down at her daughters. They went to fetch water from. Well, she whispered, that's all they went for. Her voice trembled, not with uncertainty, but with something else. Certainty. Finality. Miss Marple, who had been watching quietly from the edge of the crowd, looked up sharply. There was something in the way Eleanor had spoken that struck her. A mother's grief, yes, but also Amethyst's knowing she did not believe her. Daughters had taken their own lives, and neither did Miss Marple. The moment the bodies had been lowered, the villagers had begun to shift, many of them uncomfortable, whispering among themselves. The shock was still thick in the air, but there was another undercurrent, something unspoken, something that only a few would dare. Silu, two girls so young, what could drive them to such despair? Poor things, they must have had no hope left, but why? Why would they do it? Inspector Caldwell heard enough of these murmurs, as it seemed, because he snapped his notebook shut with an air of finality. Tragic business, okay, he said. Most unfortunate, but suicide. As it was not suicide, Elenina cut in suddenly, her voice taut with restrained, furry throat. Stilled. William, standing beside her, nodded grimly. Me daughters would not have done this. Someone, he swallowed hard, someone did this to them. Inspector Caldwell exhaled through his nose. I understand that this is a difficult time, he said, but emotions do not change facts. These young women were found hanged. There are no signs of struggle, no visible wounds to suggest otherwise. There are signs, Elenina said, her voice sharp with grief. You're simply not looking for them. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. That was the moment she chose to step forward. She moved with a quiet, unassuming grace, as though she belonged in the background. A gentle figure, small and harmless to those who did not know better, but her mind sharp as ever, had already begun to assemble the pieces. Something was very wrong. Her sharp blue eyes swept the ground, taking in every detail. Thought of those had overlooked, and then she saw it. The earth beneath the tree was dry and cracked, as one would expect during such a warm season. The villagers had trampled parts of it. But certain marks had not been disturbed, marks that had been there before the crowd arrived. Most people would not have noticed them, but Miss Marple did. Her keen eyes traced the subtle indentation of footprints, the kind left behind not by farm workers, nor by villagers accustomed to simple boots and worn shoes. These were heavier prints, distinct in shape. They had been made by a sole, with a reinforced heel with ash-sharp defined edge, a military boot or policed footwear. Miss Marple pursed her lips. Akia, this was no suicide. This was a carefully staged crime. She glanced at the rope used on the girls, examining the knots, noting the way the weight had been distributed. They had not climbed the tree themselves. They had been placed there, and whoever had done it had stood here on the ground below. Their footprints, still visible in the undisturbed dust of the well's Igia. Cold certainty settled in her stomach. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called its cry, long and mournful. Miss Marple straightened. She had no doubts now. This was not suicide. This was murder, and someone in Little Darby had gone to great lengths to make sure it looked like something else. Miss Marple took one last look at the grieving parents, at the unmoving forms of Isabella and Ruth, before turning her gaze to Inspector Caldwell. His face remained unreadable, but she noticed the way he shifted slightly, as if suddenly eager. Tali, she made a note of it. Something was not right, and, as always, she intended to find out exactly what it was. Chapter Steve, the inspectors, conclusions. 2 days passed since the bodies of Isabella and Ruth Grayson were found hanging from the old oak near the well, and yet the village of Little Darby had not settled. If anything, the unease had deepened like the hush before a storm. People whispered in corners, speaking in hushed, hurried tones whenever a member of law enforcement passed. It was the sort of gossip soaked in fear, not eyed like curiosity. The post-mortem report arrived that morning, hand-delivered by a grim-faced constable who said nothing. Ash handed it to Inspector Caldwell. Inspector had read it, nodded to himself, and, with an air of finality, had declared the case closed as suicide. The report stated no external injuries beyond those consistent with hanging, cause of death, self-inflicted -anshan. The words felt as hollow as the inspector's indifference. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair at her niece's cottage. The report spread neatly before her on the tea table. She read it twice, slowly, her pale blue eyes flickering with something between frustration and resignation. She sighed, a small, weary sound, the one that carried the weight of something deeper outside the village, bustled with its usual routines, yet beneath it was a palpable tension. The tragedy had sent a ripple through the community, leaving something unspoken lingering in the air, a question no one dared outright. Had there been a murderer among them? Miss Marple had no doubt. She had watched the inspector's announcement with quiet interest that afternoon, standing among the gathered villagers. Ash had delivered the verdict with the brisk detachment of a man eager to be done with an unpleasantity. Unfortunate, yes, but these things do happen, Caldwell had said, dusting his hands as if physically ridding himself of the case. There had been a moment of silence as the crowd absorbed the words. Then came the murmurs. Hugh out. A young boy clutched his mother's skirts, his wide eyes peeking Out as she murmured something to her neighbor, a farmer shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck, as though the afternoon heat had suddenly become unbearable. But it was Elanina Grayson who spoke first. She stood at the front, her face pale, but her voice firmly wavering. "Our daughters would not have done this," she said. Her voice did not waver, though grief sat thick in her throat. She turned to the inspector, her dark eyes burning with something raw and unrelenting. "You are wrong," she said, "and I will not rest until the truth is known." Inspector Caldwell had offered a long-suffering sigh, clearly unimpressed with the grieving mother's persistence. "Mrs. Grayson," he had said, "I understand this is a difficult time, but the facts do not change simply because we wish them to." Elanina's hands had clenched into fists at her sides. "The facts," she echoed bitterly. "Do you even know what they are?" Tension had settled over the crowd, the villagers shifting uncomfortably. No one was willing to work with the police, not openly, and yet doubt lingered in their expressions. Miss Marple had watched it all with keen interest, her gaze lingering on Inspector Caldwell's expressions, not quite impatience, not quite irritational. There was something else there, something calculated, something she had seen before in men who wished to push a matter aside. As quickly, she had also noticed the way he'd avoided looking directly at the bodies during the investigation, how he had not examined them closely before giving his verdict. That, in itself, had been very telling indeed. Now, back in the small sitting room, Miss Marple set the report aside, her fingers tracing the rim of her china teacup. The floral pattern had faded over time, the delicate edge chipped from years of careful use, much like the truth she thought a delicate thing too. Easily broken, she had seen the bodies up close, no external injuries. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. She had seen thebruses meet their collars, the odd discoloration on their wrists faint, unmistakable shadows of force applied before death. She had not forgotten the way their hands had lain unnaturally limp, not clenched, not grasping at rope and their last moments. It was wrong. It did not match. Something had been done to those girls before they were hanged. And then there was the matter of thigh footprints, heavy, deliberate prints, just off to the side of where the tree roots met the hard-packed earth, not the scuff marks of a desperate girl struggling in her final moments, but something far more controlled, intentional, military or police issue boots. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her cup. The two had been overlooked, or rather ignored, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent years understanding people, their motives, their mistakes. She had seen grief, hatred, fear, and guilt written plainly across the faces of those who had something to hide, and Inspector Caldwell's face had given her much token cider. She set her cup down with a quiet clink and rose from her chair. There was someone she needed to visit, someone who would not dismiss her concerns with a flick of the wrist, someone who, despite grief, might see the world as shattered. Elanina Grayson. If the police were determined to close this case, then it was up to Miss Marple to find the truth on her own, and she intended to dodge that chapter for secrets. In the village, the Grayson cottage stood at the far edge of Little Darbury, where the land began to stretch toward open fields and distant woodlands. It was a humble dwelling, whitewashed walls, slightly weathered by time, but the small garden out front was neat, with a row of carefully tended lavender bushes lining the path to Theodore. Miss Marple had always admired the Graysons. They were a hard-working family, polite, but private, never once to stir trouble, and yet trouble had found them today. The house bore an unmistakable weight of grief. The curtains were drawn halfway, casting long shadows over the sitting room, and the air inside was thick and still, as if the very walls were. Elanina Grayson sat by the small window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze focused across from her. William stood by the fireplace, shoulders squared, chin lifted, but there was a tension in his stance, as though holding together a grief too large to express. Miss Marple ways, a figure of gentle composure, took the seat that Elanina gestured toward. She placed her handbag neatly upon her lap, folding her hands over it. It was a moment before Chess spoke. "My dear," she said softly, "tell me everything you can about that night." Elanina's fingers tightened over the fabric of her dress, her knuckles paling. She inhaled slowly, as thought, bracing herself for a memory too painful to revisit, had gone to the purr. "Well," she murmured, "that's all, just to fetch water." Her voice, though calm, carried an underlying strain, the kind that comes one. Grief has not yet settled, but still roams restlessly through the heart. "We waited for them," she continued, "but they never came." Back a pause, then her voice faltered. "Then someone came running, told us to come at once." William turned from the fireplace, then his face lined with exhaustion and something else, something deeper than grief. "When we got there," he said, his voice rough, "we already knew before we saw them. We knew." Lenina nodded, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "Her mother knows," she whispered. Miss Marple, with a quiet sympathy, inclined her head. It was true. She thought her mother does know. She let the silence settle for a moment, then asked the question that had been waiting on her tongue. "And you believe, without a doubt, that they were murdered?" Ilalana lifted her gaze then, and Miss Marple saw fire in her eyes. "Of course," she said fiercely. "My daughters were happy. They were not these, sir, too." She swallowed hard to do such a thing. Her voice was shaking, but not with uncertainty, with fury. Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was no hesitation, no wavering in her belief. Not all grief-stricken parents were so certain, but Elalina Grayson was not simply mourning. She was determined. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "They were frightened," Ilalana said, suddenly, her voice quieter now, but heavy with meaning. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Frightened?" Shichod Ilalana nodded, her grip on the chair's armrest tightening. "Fruit told me the night before," she whispered. She thought someone was following them. Miss Marple's spine stiffened ever so slightly. "Following them?" She repeated it. Elalina murmured. She thought she saw a man watching them from the trees near the well. Miss Marple felt a cold prickle at the back of her neck. A match kept her voice calm. "Even a man?" she asked. "Did she say what he looked like?" Elalina hesitated. "No," she admitted. She only caught glimpses, but she said he was tall, and he moved like a soldier or a policeman. Miss Marple sat back, her expression, carefully composed. Outside, the wind had begun to stir the tree-sear branches, creaking faintly, the sound echoing through the quiet houses. Police had dismissed the case so quickly, too quickly. A mother and father well knew. Their daughters had been murdered, a figure lurking in the shadows, a post-mortem report that did not match the truth, and a police inspector who had an interest in asking questions. Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against the clasp of her handbag, her mind moving with precise efficiency. There was a lie woven into this case, and she had an uneasy suspicion of who had spun it. It was to meddle, visit the hospital. If the body tells the truth, and the report tells a lie, then somewhere between them lay the answer. Miss Marple rose gracefully, fraying Elalina a gentle pat on the hand. "I'll do everything I can," she promised. Elalina blinked rapidly, as though fighting tears she had not yet allowed herself to shed, and simplinated. Miss Marple turned to William. His jaw was set, his eyes dark. "Find who did this," he said simply. Miss Marple, who had already begun to piece together the shape of a terrible truth, gave him a small nod, and then, with her usual quiet, unassuming elegance, she stepped into the afternoon light, walking toward the next clue. Chapter 5. The doctor's lie at the hospital in Little Derby was an unassuming place, a modest white bricked building with an air of quiet neglect. The garden at the front, though once tended with care, had begun to fray at the edges. Ivy creeping unchecked along the stonework, weeds bushing stubbornly through the flower. Beds, hospitals, Miss Marple reflected were places of truth and deception in equal measure here. Life and death were a cartolage, signed off in neat handwriting, reduced to clinical facts on a reportant. Yet, as she well knew, reports could lie, and so could doctors. She arrived in the late afternoon when the light had turned honey gold, slanting lazily through metal windows of the quiet corridors. The nurses were preoccupied with paperwork, moving about with efficient disinterest, and no one paid much mind. To an elderly laddie wandering at her own pace, Miss Marple had always known how to become invisible. Her presence, small gentile, with faint air of harmless curiosity, was something few took seriously and not a question, and yet she had learned long ago that people revealed more when they thought no one was watching. Dr. Edmund Caldwell's office was at the end of the corridor, tucked away from the busy wards. A brass name, Kate, gleamed dully on the door. She knocked, and after a brief pause, a thin, reedy voice called out, "Yes, come in." She stepped inside. Dr. Caldwell was a wiry man, his pale complexion suggesting he saw little of daylight. His hair was thinning, neatly combed, and his watery blue eyes blinked at her in mild surprise. He said, rising from behind his desk, "Miss Marple is in it." His politeness was practiced, movements are touch too controlled, as if he were already weighing how much to say and how much to conceal. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, the sort of warm, grandmotherly smile that had disarmed many a guilty man before him. "I had some questions about the post-mortem report," she said, lightly lowering herself into a chair without waiting. "Tom?" asked Dr. Caldwell, hesitated for the briefest moment before smoothing his hands over the stack of papers before him. "Of course," he said, "but I assure you, everything was done correctly." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled pleasantly. "Oh, I am sure," she said, her tone entirely agreeable. "I'm sure you did everything you were told to do." A tiny flicker of something crossed Dr. Caldwell's face, not quite alarm, but something adjacent to it. Miss Marple continued, her voice light, conversational. "It must be rather difficult," she mused, "having a brother in the police, all that expectation, all that pressure." Dr. Caldwell's jaw twitched, just a small movement, but Miss Marple caught it. She tilted her head slightly, as though merely chatting over tea. "You see, my dear," she said, "I do find it quite puzzling that a report would state there were no external injuries when I myself saw the bruises." Dr. Caldwell's fingers curled slightly against the desk. "I'm sure you must have been mistaken," he said lightly. Miss Marple tutted, shaking her head. "That would be most unlike me," she said. A tense silence settled between them. Dr. Caldwell's throat moved as he swallowed his eyes, darting briefly to the door before returning to her. Then, quite suddenly, he stood. "I have other patients to see," he said briskly, straightening his coat. "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave." Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, observing the faint tremor in his hands as he reached for his pen. She rose, gracefully adjusting the strap of her handbag. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice as mild as ever. "One wouldn't want to keep a doctor from his duties." She turned, moving toward the door, but paused briefly before exiting. "You know," she said, airy, "I always find it fascinating the way people behave when they know something they shouldn't. The little signs, a nervous glance, the way their hands shake just slightly, the way they move a conversation along just a bit too quickly." She turned her head ever so slightly, catching the way Dr. Caldwell's posture stiffened. The doctor's duty, she murmured, is to tell the truth, and then she leapt in the quiet corridor. Miss Marple walked with calm, unhurried step, but inside Her thoughts were moving at a sharp and decisive pace. Dr. Caldwell was lying, that much was abundantly clear. But why had he altered the post-mortem report on his own? Or had he been coerced into doing so? And if so, by whom? She had a very good idol out outside the last of the evening light. It's fading into soft indigo, the edges off sky, tinged with violet. An ember, Miss Marple, paused at the hospital, gates taking a slow breath. There was still much to uncover, but she had no doubt that truth was unraveling, and soon someone in Little Derby would find themselves caught in the web of their own deceit. Chapter 6A, Sinister History. Miss Marple stepped out of the hospital's white-bricked entrance, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Along the quiet lane, her mind, as ever, was worried with careful precision, like the delicate movements of a well-maintained clock. Dr. Caldwell had lied. She had seen it in the way his fingers curled slightly against his desk, in the tension in his voice, and in his brisk posel. Her polite inquiries, it was not simply the evasions of a man caught off guard. It was a method deeper, something deliberate, and Miss Marple knew well that lies were never without purpose. As stepped onto the narrow, cobbled path, her feet carried her almost by instincting, not back toward her niece's cottage, but toward the heart of the village, toward a place where secrets lay dormant, waiting for the right pair of hands to turn pages of the past. The village archives. If there is a history to be uncovered, it will be found there. The archives of Little Derby were not grand, not like those of St. Mary, Me, or larger towns, but they had been kept dutiful over the decades. It was a small, dust-laden office tucked away beside their church, its walls lined with leather-bound ledgers and yellowed newspapers, the air thick with the scent of old ink. An aged paper. Miss Marple entered with the grace of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be, her expression mild, but her purpose razor sharp. Behind a large wooden desk, the curator sat a thin man with sharp eyes, a pointed nose, and an unfortunate fondness for peppermint sweets, which he now popped into his mouth with practiced ease. He blinked at her presence, his expression shifting to polite curiosity. Something I can help you with, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled, warm and denouncing me. Just a bit of research, dear, she said, removing her gloves with a delicate motion about an old name in the village, the Caldwell family. Curator's expression flickered with something that was not quite surprise, not quite discomfort. The Caldwells, she repeated. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. The man huffed, already rifling through a stack of old ledgers, muttering as he did so. Oh, that lot, he said, shaking his head. Been here for old generations. But the real trouble started with their father, Major Caldwell. Nasty piece of work, by all accounts. Miss Marple's knitting needles clinking it gently in her handbag. Trouble, she echoed, her voice light but inviting. The curator snorted, pulling out a dusty volume. Can't, flipping it open before my time, but I've heard the stories, he said. The Major wasn't of those men who, well, let's say, he had no fondness for people. Orientis, kind. Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly, though her tone remained pleasantly conversational. And by that, she said mildly, you mean he was involved in certain anti-black movements? The curator hesitated, then cast a quick glance over his shoulder, as if fearful of unseen ears more than involved. He muttered, he was one of the leaders of that wretched group stirring up trouble, saying black folk didn't belong in the village rallies. Threats, intimidation. He was careful enough to keep it all just within the law, never got himself arrested. But people knew. He gave a dry chuckle, though it held no humor. Of course, after the war, things changed. The world changed. He went quiet, but folks never forgot. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. A man who had hated black people, a son who had joined the police force, a cover-up that was all too convenient. She could see it now, the pattern weaving itself together. The murder of Isabel and Ruth Grayson was not merely a crime, it was an echo of an old hatred, one that had fed one that had been waiting for an opportunity to strike again, and Miss Marple had no doubt that the sins of the father had not died with him. She glanced back at the curator, who had settled back into his chair, rubbing at his temples, stalled unearthing these. Memories had brought back an old headache. She smiled sweetly. "You have been very helpful," she said. The curator blinked, as if surprised by the compliment. "Oh," he muttered. "Well, glad to be of assistance." Miss Marple adjusted the strap of a handbag, nodding politely before turning to leave. Outside, the evening air was cool at the sky, fading into a dusky lavender hue. She walked at a measured pace, but her thoughts were moving swift, precisely. This was not just murder. This was a crime of hate, one carefully orchestrated, and concealed, and she knew exactly where to go. Next chapter. 7. A murderer exposed. A police station in Little Derby was a small, nondescript building, kind that had never been needed for much more than the occasional case of stolen livestock or a drunken scofflifter, a village fate it had never borne. Witness to a crime such as this, and yet a day, it seemed to loom over the square, its unassuming brick facade concealing something dark and unspoken. Miss Marple approached the station with measured steps, her handbag neatly tucked in the crook of her arm, her expression one of quiet determination. She has walked through many doors in her time, sat across from many guilty men, and recognized the shape of a mind scrambling to hold itself together inside. The air was stale with paper and ink, the tick of a clock too loud in dissonance. The constable at the desk gave her a quick, wary glance before nodding toward the back office. Inspector Caldwell sat at his desk, his long fingers strumming impatiently against the wood. He did not look up immediately, but when he did, his expression barely masked his irritation. "You again," he muttered. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her presence as calm and unhurried as ever. "My dear Inspector," she said, mildly lowering herself into the chair opposite him, "I do believe I've solved your case." Caldwell's brows lifted just slightly, but his bored expression did not change. "I have you now." Miss Marple nodded, fingering the clasp of her handbag, her voice never rising above a gentle conversational tone. "You see," she said, "I have been looking into things, the history of this village, the history of your own family, Spectre, and I must say, it does make for a rather dreadful story." For the first time, a flicker of something dangerous crossed Caldwell's face, a hesitation, a shadow of something buried to miss. Marple continued, her words soft but unrelenting. "It must have been quite difficult for you," she mused, blowing up under. "A father like Major Caldwell, a man who, how shall I put it, believed in keeping the village a certain way, and I imagine you felt steezing, didn't you?" Caldwell's jaw tightened, his fingers pressing down just a little too hard against the desk. "You're talking nonsense, old woman." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her expression almost curious. "But I wonder," she went on, "was it simply hatred that made you do it, or was it something else? A personal slight, perhaps?" Silence. The room fell to smaller. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. He spoke with Elenina Grayson, she said, "and she told me something quite interesting, that a few days before her daughters were killed, her husband had an argument with you." Caldwell's fingers curled on the desk, his posture stiffening. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And then there's the matter of the post-mortem," she added, "conducted by none other than your own brother, a most convenient arrangement, wouldn't you say?" Caldwell's eyes flashed, but he remained insolent. "You have no proof," he said finally, his voice low and controlled. Miss Marple sighed softly, as though chiding a misbehaving child. "My dear boy, I have quite enough," she said gently. She ticked off her points with quiet precision to bruises hidden beneath. The girls' collars, the distinct shoe prints at the crime scene, the kind only worn by the police or military and off course. Your little visit to the well that night. You just happened to cross paths with 2 black girls. She murmured, girls whose father you had argued with. Curls she thought no one would miss. Caldwell's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. Shut up, he muttered. Miss Marple remained seated, entire like him. But I do know, she said, her voice like silk covering steel. And so do thy constables outside this door, who have been listening to your every word. A beat-off silence. Then the door swung open, and 2 stern-faced officers stepped inside. Caldwell froze his mouth, tightening. Miss Marple smiled, ever so slightly, her voice still warm, almost motherly. It's over, Inspector, she said. Hatred has no place in justice. For a moment, Caldwell did not move, did not breathe. Then, with a bitter laugh, he muttered, those girls should never have been here in the first place. It was a confession in every way that mattered. The officers stepped forward, their grips firm. As they reached for him, Caldwell did not struggle, but his face was twisted with something ugly, something that had been festering for far too long. As they led him away, Miss Marple exhaled softly, smoothing the crease in her skirt. The case, it seemed, was finalized. She rose, collected her handbag, and stepped out into the quiet village evening, where the air was lighter than it had been in days, and with a measured grace, she began the walk home. Chapter 8. Justice and Tea. The village was quiet. In aftermath, news of Inspector Caldwell's arrest had spread quickly, moving through the narrow lanes and clustered cottages like the final pill of a long overdue church bell. Some villagers expressed disbelief. After all, he had been their lawman for years, a presence they had come to accept as simply part of Little Derby. Others, however, were less surprised, exchanging knowing glances, recalling whispers from years past, memories of his father, Major Caldwell, and the bitterness that ran in his bloodline like an inherited illness. Graysons, grieving, yet unbowed, mourned their daughters in a way that no parent should ever have to. But this time, their grief was met with justice, not silence. There would be no quiet burial of truth, no whispered apologies or glances that turned away in awkward discomfort. This time, the village had listened, and justice, slow though it had been, had finally come. God, Edmund Caldwell found himself summoned from his comfortable office. His hands had always been steady with a scalpel, but they trembled when the authorities came for him. Falsifying reports, obstructing justice. There was no avoiding the weight of his own complicity. The villagers watched as he was led away, not with the same shock that had met his brother's arrest, but with a quiet, grim acknowledgement. After all, there were those who committed murder, and there were those who helped to cover it up. Both, Miss Marple thought, were equally deserving of their fate. And as for Miss Marple, she walked home at a measured pace, the evening air crisp but no tongue-end, the scent of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke mingling as she neared her niece's cottage. She had been away from her knitting for too long. The small sitting room welcomed her with its familiar, comfortable clutter, the half-knitted tea-cosy draped over the armrest, the book she had been meaning to finish, the faintest scent of lavender from a sachet tucked in the drawer of the writing desk on the side table. A freshly brewed pot of tea awaited her, the steam curling into the air in gentle, delicate wisps. Lowered herself into her well-worn chair, sighing ever so slightly as she settled in her fingers, reaching instinctively for the soft wool of her knitting project. For a moment, she simply watched the firelight dance against the porcelain rim of her teacup, sharp blue eyes reflecting the flicker of something softer, more thoughtful. She had seen many things in her lifetime. People often assumed that evil announced itself boldly with a villain's sneer or the dramatic flourish of of a criminal act, but Miss Marple had long since learned that true evil was quiet. It was in the small things, the overlooked details, the hatred that settled into a person's bones and passed from generation to generation, and yet so too was justice. It was in the persistence of those who would not let the truth be buried in the way a single voice, no matter how small, could unravel the tightest of lies. She took a deliberate sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her fingers, through the worn china and into her hands. Yes, she thought evil had a way of creeping into the most ordinary place that so too did justice, and that, she decided, was something worth needing for synopsis. Miss Marple and the shadows by the well in the quiet village of Little Darby. A horrifying discovery shatters peace, the bodies of two young black sisters, Isabella and Ruth Grayson, are found hanging from an old oak tree near the village. Well, the local authorities, who by Inspector Caldwell are quick to rule their deaths as suicide, dismissing any suggestion of foul play, but Miss Jane Marple, visiting her niece in the village, is not so easily convinced. With their keen eye for detail and deep understanding of human nature, she notices inconsistencies, the telltale signs of bruises hidden beneath their collars, the disturbed earth near the well, and mysteriously shoe prints belonging to someone in a position of authority. Their mind to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of prejudice and deception. Miss Marple begins her quiet but unrelenting investigation. As she speaks with the grieving parents, she learns that their girls had been frightened before their deaths, believing someone had been watching them. Her inquiries lead her to the village archives, where she uncovers a sinister history, one that ties Todd case directly to Caldwell's own family, Major Caldwell. The inspector's late father had been a well-known figure in a violent anti-black movement, stirring high tide and division in the community. Though his time had passed, it becomes clear that his ideology lived on in his son. Miss Marple pieces together the killing reality. Inspector Caldwell murdered the two girls, disguising it as suicide, and enlisted his brother, Dredmond Caldwell, to falsify the post-mortem report to erase any trace of crime. In a final confrontation at the police station, Miss Marple, with the usual sharp wit and quiet authority, lays out the evidence, piece by piece, exposing the motive, the cover-up, and the damning proof of Caldwell's presence at the scene of the crime, with the constables listening in. Caldwell is finally forced to confess his hatred and guilt, spilling out in a bitter, venomous declaration. He and his brother are arrested, ensuring that the Grayson family receives the justice they deserve. With the case solved, Miss Marple returns to her cozy cottage, where a warm pot of tea and her half-knitted tea cozy await her as she sips her tea. She reflects on the truth she has come to understand all too well, that evil often hides in the most ordinary places, but so too does justice.